Good morning, everyone. Wow. Try to ratchet that back a little bit. Good morning, everyone. I am glad to see all of you here and glad to be with you on this Sunday morning as we have come together to glorify God. However, at least from my end, things are going to go a little bit differently this morning. During the last meeting of the leadership of the whole church, the elders, the deacons, and the evangelists, one of the things that was discussed was the preaching. And even though the men there were generally very complimentary of the work that Clay and I do, something that they said was that they wanted us to be willing, if there was something going on that needed to be talked about from the pulpit, that they wanted us to be willing to abandon what we had prepared to speak on in order to address that need. Normally, that's something that I am very reluctant to do. I know that there are so many men and women in this congregation who work hard every week so that they can provide for their families, so that they can put the money in the plate that provides for Clay and me and our families. And it's important to me to honor that by making sure that I work hard every week too. And I don't think too much of the preachers out there who work for 10 hours of the week, spend the rest of the week working on their golf game, and then get up and preach on Sunday morning. So this is not something that I am inclined to do. But I think that this morning it is time to do that. As I was working on the sermon that I had prepared to preach this morning, I was running through it as I always do. And the whole time I was doing that, there was a voice in the back of my head that was saying, this ain't right. This ain't what the people need to hear from me. And so I decided to do that. So that sermon outline that all of you have carefully collected from the back, that Jennifer so thoughtfully printed, that is not what we are going to be talking about. We will address the importance of placing membership at some other time. I think that's good, but this is not the week for that. Instead, what I want to talk about this morning is, I think, what many of us, perhaps most of us, have been thinking about all week. And that is the coronavirus pandemic that is currently sweeping the world. Much of the discussion that I have seen online about this has to do with the assembly. Whether Christians and congregations should continue to meet in the face of suggestions or even ordinances that say you should quarantine yourself, you shouldn't come to worship. Concerning that, here's what I have to say. I think it is up to the conscience of every individual and to the leadership of every congregation to decide what they should do. I am not going to judge anyone for what that decision is, because who am I to judge another servant? When it comes to this congregation, I trust the judgment of the elders. I support their decision to continue assembling, and whatever decision they make in the future, I will continue to support them in that. And if they want to know what my opinion is, then they can come to me and I will tell them. Even beyond that, though, I think that this is a time in our lives that raises much bigger issues than simply the question of whether we should come together. Instead, this is a time that calls us to contemplate one of those fundamental truths that is at the heart of human existence, and it's a truth that we don't like to think about. And it is our own mortality. How we should deal with the fact that we are not going to be here forever, and how we should live our lives in the light of God according to that. And so what I would like to do this morning, completely extemporaneously, honestly, is I would like us to work our way together through the 90th Psalm to see what this can teach us about how we should behave as Christians in a time of an epidemic. So yes, just turn to Psalm 90. We'll be spending the entire lesson there. This is a psalm that is ascribed to Moses. I believe it is the only one that is so ascribed. And ever since I was a young man, this is one that has always been powerful and meaningful to me. Let's begin by considering the first 6 verses. Lord, you have been our refuge in every generation. Before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from eternity to eternity, you are God. You return mankind to the dust, saying, "Return, descendants of Adam. For in your sight 1,000 years are like eternity that passes by, like a few hours of the night. You end their lives, they sleep. They are like grass that grows in the morning. In the morning it sprouts and grows. By evening it withers and dries up." In this reading, I think there are 2 main points that all of us need to consider. The first is that this tells us something crucial about the nature of God. It tells us that He is eternal. Indeed, that He is a being who is incomprehensibly different than any of us are. His lifetime, His existence, is not bounded by any earthly events. We can think of all the scope of human history, all the things that have happened on this globe for thousands of years. God witnessed every one of them. God lived through every one of them. But Moses goes even farther than that. He says that even before the mountains were born, before the world existed, when all of the order and structure that we see around us was just formless chaos, even then, God was still God. And what is more, God is not just God from everlasting. God is God to everlasting. That just as God has always been, so God always will continue to be. There will never be a moment of existence in which God does not exist. And that makes Him someone who is so different from us, who is so different from our experience that we can scarcely comprehend it. Moses goes on to observe, though, that we are not like that. That instead, as God is watching us, to Him, 1,000 years that is going by, that's just like a watch in the night. That's just like 4 hours of darkness. That's all that 1,000 years is to God. And indeed, to Him, we are even less. The older I get, the more I appreciate how short my life seems. Just the other day, I was talking to one of the people with whom some of us play Dungeons & Dragons, and we were talking about this new computer game that is going to be coming out in a few months called Baldur's Gate 3. And I said, "Hey, I remember playing Baldur's Gate 1 back in 1997. And he looked at me and said, "Well, you know, Baldur's Gate 1, that came out 3 years before I was born." And 1997 doesn't seem that long ago to me. And I know that there are those here for whom 1957 doesn't seem that long ago. So even to us, these years and decades of time, they seem short. But how much shorter do they seem to God? To God, all of us seem like the grass. We seem like those bugs that are swarming around at this time of year, and then by April and May and June, they're gone. You're not going to see them anymore. God is eternal, but every one of us is transitory. And next to Him, we are nothing in comparison. The psalmist goes on to consider the implications of this in the next several verses. He says, "For we are consumed by your anger, we are terrified by your wrath. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days ebb away under your wrath. We end our years like a sigh. Our lives last 70 years, or if we are strong, 80 years. Even the best of them are struggle and sorrow. Indeed, they pass quickly, and we fly away. Who understands the power of your anger? your wrath matches the fear that is due you. Teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. The first thing that this text tells us is that our mortality is not just sort of this vague, indefinite concept. That it is something that pretty much all of us instead can pretty much put a hard limit on. Moses observes that our lives last 70 years, or if we are strong, 80 years. He himself made 120. That was, I think, exceptional even then. But still, all of us just have these few decades to deal with. This is something that humankind has fought against since the beginning. We have made all of these advances in medical care. We have all of these well-staffed and carefully thought-out hospitals. We have people who go through years and years of study in order to become doctors. And we're constantly pushing against that limit, constantly trying to extend our lifespan so that each one of us can live longer and longer. This text, though, reveals how futile those efforts are. That ultimately, when we are confronting death, we are confronting a force that is greater and more powerful than any of us. Some of you may have seen, as I have seen, those graphs of the coronavirus and how it's broken down by age group. How if you're young, if you're in your 20s, then 0.2% of the people who get it then are going to die. 0.4% of those who are in their 40s who get it, they're going to die. For everybody else, it might not be much more than an attack of the sniffles. But that graph doesn't hold true for very long, does it? That once you start getting up into the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, that graph takes this exponential swing upward. And the first time I saw that, the verse that I thought of was verse 10 here in Psalm 90. Our lives last 70 years, or if they are strong, 80 years. Some have speculated that the coronavirus is God's judgment upon us for some particular sin, perhaps abortion or something else like that. But what Moses tells us here reveals that it is not any particular sin that God has in mind. That God does not allow this destruction and devastation to sweep across the world because of one thing that we have done. Instead, we decline because of the wrath of God against all sin. This is something that goes all the way back to Genesis 3. When in the face of Adam's sin and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God said to him, "From the dust you were taken, to the dust you will return." That is the divine decree. That is the way that God reacted to sin. And I think when we think about it, when we think about how awful all of us would be if we just lived forever in accumulated wickedness, I think it's the only choice that God could make. And so, all of those hospitals and all of those doctors and all of those disease control labs that are scrambling to come up with tests and vaccines and medicines to deal with the coronavirus and cancer and all the other things that strike us down. Ultimately, all of those things, as well-intentioned as they are, despite all the good that those people do, in the end, for all of us, those measures are going to prove futile. Because if the earth continues long enough, every one of us is going to hit against that Genesis 3 limit. Every one of us is going to hit against that Psalm 90 and verse 10 limit. Every one of us is going to die, because that is what God has promised us. And I think that's why we see so much fear, so much concern, that people are going out and buying this lifetime supply of toilet paper so that they will never again have to emerge from the house because of this coronavirus. I think that fundamentally what they're doing is they're trying to pretend that this verse doesn't apply to them. that if they take enough precautions, if they are careful enough, then somehow they are going to get more than their 70 or their fourscore years if according to strength. But the reality is that none of us are going to beat it. Maybe we aren't going to die from the coronavirus. Maybe we aren't even going to get the coronavirus. But unless the Lord comes back, every one of us is surely going to die. Because that is the divine judgment against sin. That means then that we need to do what Moses advises us to do in verse 12. That we need to number our days so that we can develop wisdom. There's a passage that is commonly read at funerals and not much elsewhere. It's in Ecclesiastes, where Solomon tells us that it is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for that is the end of every man, and the wise take it to heart. This too is a moment in our lives that we should take to heart. That we should seek to understand, that we should learn from. Our society does not really like to think about death. In fact, I think it's fair to say that Americans as a whole really hate to think about death. Have you ever thought about the cultural implications of how we put sick people in hospitals and we put old people in nursing homes so that we don't have to look at them? So that we can go through our days and never be reminded of our mortality. Well, in the face of an epidemic, everybody is reminded of their mortality. And they don't like to think about it because what that tells them is that being godless and self-centered is a disastrous course of life. Instead, we need to consider these things. We need to consider our own transitory nature, the time that we spend on the earth, and say, what does that tell me right now about what I need to do to prepare for what is to come? I've been to lots of funerals in my life. That's one of the things that preachers do. But I know that the day is coming when I am going to be the star of the funeral, and so will every one of the rest of you. Since that is so, since it is certain that all of us are appointed to death, and after that is going to come the judgment, where are we in our preparations for that judgment? Can we consider our lives right now and say, if this horrible illness strikes me down, or if I get in a car wreck on the way home from services, if these things happen, am I prepared? Am I ready? That's the way that wisdom tells us to think. Wisdom says, remember God, remember Jesus. Remember that in a world where everyone eventually perishes, only they hold out hope. And then say, either I have done what I need to do to lay hold of that hope, or more than anything else right now, I need to do it. That's what wisdom looks like. Foolishness, though. Foolishness says, I'm going to be careful. I'm going to beat this thing. I'm going to wash my hands 60 times a day. I am going to make sure that I'm not going to get it. And I'm going to beat all the other things. All of the other things that cause people to die, they're not going to touch me either. I'm just going to go on living and living and living. And there are lots of people who think that way. They think about it because they don't want to think about the end. And when the end comes for them, as it inevitably must, then the end will find them unprepared. And that's not where I want any of us who are here this morning to be. I want to make sure that all of us are numbering our days, counting up all of those days that we have left in order to make sure that we are living wisely before God. Let's conclude by considering verses 13 through 17. Lord, how long? Turn and have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your faithful love, so that we may shout with joy and be glad all our days. Make us rejoice for as many days as you have humbled us, for as many years as we have seen adversity. Let your work be seen by your servants and your splendor by their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be on us. Establish for us the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. Once again, I think there are two main themes here. The first is a prayer for God's protection and for God's blessing in this life. I think this is particularly moving when it is coming from somebody like Moses, who says, "Make us rejoice for as many days as you have humbled us, for as many years as we have seen adversity." Moses was not somebody who lived an easy life. He was driven from a life of pleasure in Egypt to go out in the desert and be a shepherd. Then he came back and redeemed the Israelites from Egypt with the power of God. And then he went back out into the desert for 40 years and watched all of these people whom he had helped God rescue die because they were foolish and evil. So Moses is saying, according to all those horrible years, God, may your people see good. Recently, I think it's fair to say that many of us have been enjoying prosperity. The last recession that our country has faced took place in 2008, 2009. Up till now, this has been the longest bull market in the history of the U.S. stock market. So we've seen lots of prosperity. And I think there are lots of people who think that prosperity is the way that it is. That somehow it is our birthright as human beings, as citizens of the United States of America, to have good times, to have all the material goods that we like. That ain't so, brethren. That's not how things work. We might say, yes, we live in the greatest and best country that the world has ever known. We're so wealthy, we're so powerful, we're so wise, we're so technologically advanced. And yet, as Solomon observes in Ecclesiastes, time and chance overtake them all. There is no reason why things have to continue as well as they have. And in fact, it may well be true that the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 15 years, the next 20 years, and so on, are not as good as the years that we have enjoyed. Because those things are not in our power, they are not in anyone's power to ensure. Now, I think it's always funny during every presidential election how the incumbent president is judged on how well the economy is done. You know, that's about like judging the ship captain on how stormy the ocean has been. Even the president has little to no control over how the economy does. And how much more the rest of us? How much more for all of us are our lives at the mercy of God? When we receive good, when we enjoy prosperity, when we enjoy good health, we don't have those things because we have earned them and we deserve them. We have those things because God is good and gracious and has chosen to bless us with them even though we are often ungrateful. When we receive things that we do not enjoy, when we deal with poverty and disease and heartbreak, those things too are part of life under the sun. And God has never promised even the most faithful of his new covenant people that they will be prosperous forever. So let us remember then that yes, it's good to wash our hands. I guess you can put on the little breath mask and everything else if you want to. But in the end, our safety and our health and our good fortune, all of those things we receive from God and from God alone. And if we ever think that somehow we have earned these things for ourselves, or that we can guarantee that we will receive these things for ourselves, then we are doing nothing more than inviting disaster. The final thing that I want us to consider this morning is Moses' plea in verse 17. Establish the works of our hands, or as the New American Standard has it, confirm the works of our hands. Let me begin by observing that in an earthly sense, that is impossible. It may be that we have devoted our lives to building up some business that we own. Well, sooner or later, that business is going to go out of business. Maybe we devote our lives to this congregation. Sooner or later, I imagine that the day will come when the Jackson Heights Church of Christ will close its doors. We might devote ourselves to our nation, this powerful and great and mighty United States of America. If history teaches me anything, it is that kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. And all of the efforts of good men can do nothing to prevent that. The day will come when even the United States of America is not found on a world map. For that matter, even the world itself is not eternal. Peter tells us in 2 Peter 3 that everything that we see around us is going to be destroyed by fire. Not just the maps of the world, but the world itself. So we might look at that and we say, well, what in the world is Moses talking about? How can we reasonably ask God to confirm anything that we have done? How can we do anything that is going to last and be meaningful? Well, it certainly won't happen in this life. It's something that can only happen in the life to come. It is something that can only happen not in this kingdom, but in the heavenly kingdom. The day will come when the righteous will shine forth like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. The day will come when the good works of even the most insignificant Christian, the day will come when even those works will be remembered. The day will come when God, who has forgotten our sins through Christ, when God will remember those good works and will celebrate them and will honor them, and it will allow them to shine through all of eternity for His glory. Those are the works that will be established. And for all of us who are faithful, for all of us who are submitting to His will, we can do so in the confidence that the things that we do matter now and will matter forever. Indeed, serving God is the only way to do anything that will matter. God has promised that He will establish those things. But everything else will be consumed when the earth itself is consumed. There are many other things that we might give our lives to our jobs, to our families, to all of these earthly goals. But if we have a life that is bent toward anything but God, it is fundamentally a wasted life that is going to end in disaster and failure. And I think we see this as we consider all of these people who, mostly in other countries for now, thankfully, but all of these people who are dying. It's probably true that most of them were not right with God when they died. And it is probably true that most in this country who will die in the weeks and months to come many of those people will likewise not be right with God. The choice for us then is, are we going to confront our mortality now? Are we going to keep building on the things that won't last? Are we going to keep building on the things that are going to be washed away in the deluge? Or are we going to build in the city that has foundations? Are we going to build on the rock? Those are the two ways to live life. And the only way that God is going to answer our prayer to establish us is if we are building on Him. Let me ask then, all of you who are here this morning, are you building on God? Are you confident that if this disease takes you, if 3 weeks from now, a month from now, you are in that hospital bed and you are dying, Are you confident that your eternity is assured and secure? Have you built on something that you can trust in? If you haven't, well, it's a grim place to be. Because even if this doesn't get us, as I said, something else will. And once that happens, if we have not laid up that treasure in heaven, then we will spend eternity impoverished. So if that's where you are, and you'd like to make a change this morning, then let us help you. It may be that you need to be baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins, to become a disciple, to start working toward that that heavenly inheritance, to receive the everlasting blessing that is only possible through Jesus. And if you would like to be baptized, to become part of his people, then we'd be happy to help you this morning. Or it may be that you have done that, but you recognize that even though your pledge of discipleship on that day said one thing, that your life is saying another. That instead of building on the rock, that you've been building on a whole bunch of sand pits all around. I hope that eternity doesn't catch you there, my friend. And if you see that it's going to, and you recognize that you need help, well, we're here to help you. And we'd be happy to pray with you so that you can be restored to fellowship with your God and with your Savior. But whatever your need, recognize the transitory nature of this life and the eternity of God. Place your hope in him. Come now while we stand and while we sing.